My name is Claire Alderton. I'm 29 years old. On the third Saturday of May, at 11:43 in the morning, my father stood up from his seat in the fifth row of Westbrook University's outdoor graduation amphitheater, pointed his finger directly at my face in front of 400 parents, siblings, grandparents, and faculty members, and said, loud enough for the entire row behind him to hear every syllable, "You have no business being here. You are a dropout. You are an embarrassment to this family. Leave, now." My mother did not look at me. She studied her lap. My sister Natalie, who was somewhere in the procession line in her cap and gown, did not yet know I was there. The couple sitting to my father's left shifted uncomfortably in their white plastic folding chairs. A grandmother 3 seats down stopped fanning herself with her program. 2 children in the row directly ahead of us turned around to look at me with the open, unguarded curiosity that children have when something confuses them and they have not yet learned to pretend otherwise. An older man in the row behind my father cleared his throat and looked away in the direction of the stage. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I folded my hands on top of the program in my lap, looked my father in the eye for exactly 3 seconds, and then looked calmly forward at the empty podium on the stage. What they didn't know was that I had not driven to that campus to watch my sister graduate. I had driven there because 4 months earlier, Dean Margaret Hargrove of Westbrook University had sent me a formal letter on university letterhead, asking me to deliver the keynote address at this very ceremony. I had accepted. My name was already printed in the commencement program sitting in my father's hands. He just hadn't looked past the first page. This is that story. To understand what happened on that Saturday morning in May, you have to understand what the Alderton family looked like from the inside. Because from the outside, we looked completely fine. We looked like a family that had figured things out. A 2-story colonial house on a cul-de-sac in a quiet neighborhood in Cary, North Carolina. Good public schools. 2 reliable cars in the driveway. A vegetable garden in the backyard that my mother tended with actual care. Christmas lights every December, taken down promptly in early January. A family that showed up to things. A family that knew how to perform togetherness when the occasion required it. From the outside, we were unremarkable in the best possible way. My father, Douglas Alderton, is 58 years old. He spent his entire career as a regional sales director for a commercial printing company headquartered in Greensboro, a company he would tell you about at length at any dinner party if you gave him even a minor opening. He wore that job like a second skin, like a defining characteristic that preceded his name. He talked about quarterly targets and regional accounts and print volume the way other men talk about their golf handicap, with both pride and an undertone of exhaustion, as though the identity and the labor had fused into one thing he carried everywhere. He had a firm handshake, a predictable wardrobe of pressed khakis and collared shirts in muted blues and grays, and a measured, authoritative opinion about everything from highway construction to the correct way to approach a career. He was not a cruel man in the obvious ways. He never raised his voice to a shout. He never slammed doors. He never broke things. His damage was the quieter kind, the kind that wears the costume of high standards, the kind that looks from a distance like principled fatherhood, and only reveals itself as something else entirely when you are close enough to feel its actual temperature. My mother, Patricia Alderton, is 55 years old. She worked as a librarian at Barringer Elementary School in Cary for 22 years, and she was genuinely good at it in the way that people are good at things that suit their deepest nature. She was warm in a real way, the kind of woman who remembered the names of all her students' pets and their siblings, who sent birthday cards in February for parties she had attended back in October. Who could make a child feel fully seen in the space of a 3-minute conversation in the hallway between the picture books and the early readers? But Patricia's warmth had a geometry to it that I understood very early on. It was not evenly distributed. It was precisely shaped around whoever she was most proud of in any given season of her life. It concentrated in particular places and left other places in the shade. And for as long as I can remember, in every season that mattered, that warmth concentrated on my sister. My sister Natalie is 24 years old. She is the kind of person who makes the people around her look slightly disorganized just by existing in the same space, not through any deliberate effort on her part, but simply because she is organized in a way that is native to her, the way some people are naturally musical or naturally athletic. She graduated from Jefferson High School in Cary with a 4.0 grade point average, a merit scholarship to Westbrook University, a commendation from her English teacher for a senior thesis on media ethics, and a standing ovation at the Spring Talent Show. She studied communications at Westbrook and had accepted a position at a public relations firm in Raleigh before she had even walked across the stage. She was not unkind to me growing up. I want to be precise about that, because this is not a story about a sister who made things harder. Natalie simply occupied a different universe within our household, a sunlit one with better furniture and more visitors. I lived in the same house, but I lived in the basement of it, not by choice, by the quiet, repeated decisions of the people who ran the house. I was not a bad student. I want to be clear about that from the very beginning because it matters to everything that comes after. I graduated from Jefferson High School in Cary with a 3.7 grade point average, which my father described once, without the slightest trace of irony, as not bad for someone who doesn't really apply herself. I had been accepted to Prescott College in Asheville, North Carolina to study business administration, and it was the only school I had applied to because it was the only program that made genuine sense to me at 18 years old. I wanted to understand how companies worked from the inside. I wanted to understand why certain brands made people feel something and others did not. I wanted to understand the science of attention and the architecture of a good message, and the mechanics behind why someone chooses one product over another when both are available on the same shelf. My father thought this was impractical to the point of being almost embarrassing. He told me on the drive home from my acceptance letter dinner, while we sat at a red light on Kildare Farm Road with the radio off, that business administration was a degree for people who couldn't commit to anything real. He had wanted me to study accounting. He said accounting was something a person could always fall back on. He said the word fall with the comfortable authority of a man who was already certain that falling was the most likely outcome of any direction I chose. I enrolled in Prescott anyway. My mother co-signed the loan paperwork. My father did not come to move-in day. The first year was genuinely good. Better than good. I was learning things that felt alive to me in a way that very little of high school ever had. I was reading case studies about marketing campaigns that had changed the fortunes of entire companies. I was studying consumer behavior, brand psychology, the mechanics of digital advertising. In the spring of my freshman year, I took a digital marketing elective taught by a professor named Dr. Dative, Elena Bowen, and something clicked during her third lecture in a way that I still find difficult to fully articulate. It was the feeling of finally seeing the instructions for something you had already been trying to build without knowing it. I started a small blog that semester, applying what I was learning in real time, running experimental paid advertising campaigns with $30 of my own money, building simple landing pages and testing different headline variations and watching the data come back and tell me things. By the end of that semester, the blog had generated enough visible results that 2 small local businesses in the Asheville area reached out and asked whether I could do the same kind of work for them on a professional basis. That summer, I returned to Cary, and while my parents believed I was resting and preparing for sophomore year, I was sitting at the kitchen table most mornings running social media content and paid advertising for a small bakery and a local landscaping company. By the end of July, I had made $3,200, which I tracked to the dollar in a spreadsheet I had built myself, with columns for revenue, hours, deliverables, and results. My father came into the kitchen one evening while I was working, poured himself a cup of coffee, and asked what I was doing on my laptop. I told him I was studying for fall classes. He nodded and walked back to the living room. He did not ask a follow-up question. In all the years I worked from that table, he never once asked a follow-up question. Sophomore year is when everything came apart in the way my parents would later call a failure. I returned to Prescott in August, and by October I had 4 paying clients and a 5th in serious conversation. I had also run the numbers very carefully and arrived at a conclusion that felt both obvious and uncomfortable. I was about to spend another year and a half and approximately $60,000 more in student loans attending classes that were teaching me theory I was already applying in practice. At a pace significantly slower than the pace at which I was learning in real time. I could see the math. I could see where the 2 lines diverged. I drove home for Thanksgiving that November with a folder in my bag and a decision already made in every part of me that makes decisions. I sat my parents down at the dining room table on the Sunday after Thanksgiving dinner, after the dishes had been washed and Natalie had gone to visit a friend. I placed the 1-page business plan I had written on the table in front of them, and I walked them through it for approximately 8 minutes. Current client count, current monthly revenue, projected annual growth, the exact cost of continuing at Prescott versus the exact opportunity I was giving up by staying. I spoke calmly. My voice did not shake. When I finished, my father picked up the business plan. He looked at it. He looked at it for 11 seconds. I counted. And then he placed it face down on the table. "You want to quit college to run Instagram accounts," he said. Not a question. A verdict already handed down. "It's significantly more than that," I said. "I'm managing paid advertising across multiple platforms, building content strategy, running email marketing, tracking campaign analytics. Claire." He held up one hand. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear me. Nobody will take you seriously without a degree. Not one person in any room that matters. You can spend a year playing around on the internet and make yourself feel productive, and then one day you will look up and realize you were 25 with no qualifications and nowhere to go. And when that happens, we are not going to be here to catch you." He looked at my mother. My mother looked at the inverted page of the business plan on the table. She did not turn it over. I thanked them both for listening. 3 weeks later, on the 7th of December, I withdrew from Prescott College. The 3 years that followed were the coldest years of my life in terms of family. It was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no formal scene, no pronouncement. There was simply a gradual, steady reduction in warmth. The way a room grows cold when a fire goes out quietly, degree by degree, until at some point you realize you can see your own breath. Phone calls became infrequent and shorter when they occurred. Holiday visits became structured around events rather than actual time together, surface level and safe, and orbiting almost entirely around Natalie. When good things happened in my work, I found myself editing before I spoke, simplifying, hedging, already preparing for the polite nod that meant the conversation was going to move somewhere else the moment I stopped talking. I have 3 specific memories from those years that I want to give you, because vague unhappiness is too easy to dismiss. Specifics are harder to dismiss. Specifics stay. The first, Easter Sunday, 2 years after I withdrew from Prescott, my grandmother's house in Burlington. 15 people around a long folding table, covered in a yellow floral cloth she had owned for 30 years. My Aunt Ellen asked me how work was going. I had just signed my 7th client and crossed $8,000 in monthly revenue for the first time in my life. I began to answer her. I got through perhaps 1.5 sentences before my father, who was not even looking at me, said across the table in the tone of someone summarizing something minor, "She's doing some internet stuff. It keeps her busy." That was the sentence. Not shouted, not cruel in any way a witness could name, just precise in the way that erasure can be precise. My aunt smiled politely. The conversation returned to Natalie's upcoming semester abroad in Madrid. I folded my napkin in my lap and did not speak again for the better part of an hour. The second memory, 6 months after that Easter, in the fall. Natalie had been offered a part-time internship at a media consulting firm in Raleigh. My father made a dinner reservation at an Italian restaurant in downtown Raleigh for the whole family to celebrate. I drove 45 minutes to be there. I wore something nice and arrived on time. I ordered carefully from the menu. At the end of the meal, when the dessert plates had been cleared, My father raised his glass and looked at Natalie and said, "To the one who's doing it right." He looked at Natalie. He did not look at me. My mother raised her glass. I raised mine because what do? You raise the glass. You smile the way you have learned to smile at these dinners where the glass is raised and the smile is required and neither one is actually for you. The third memory, and the one that became the hinge of this entire story, the February before Natalie's graduation. My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual because she rarely initiated calls. I answered on the second ring. She told me about the ceremony in May, the Westbrook University amphitheater, the dinner reservation at the Marriott afterward, the headcount deadline, and then, after she had delivered the logistics with the efficient warmth she reserved for practical conversations, she said something in that particular careful voice she used for things she knew were difficult but had decided were necessary. "Claire, I think it might be better for everyone if you didn't come to the ceremony itself. You know how your father is in those kinds of public situations, and we really don't want anything to distract from Natalie's day. The dinner afterward might be perfectly fine, but the ceremony, in front of everyone, might just be too much. For all of you." She paused. "Then, you understand, don't you?" I told her I understood. I thanked her for letting me know. I said I would think about the dinner. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table in Durham with the overhead light on and my coffee growing cold beside me. And I thought about that phrase. You understand, don't you? Not a real question. A statement dressed as a question. An invitation to agree that my own presence at my sister's graduation was something that required management. That I was a complication. That I was something to be quietly redirected away from the good events in this family's life, the way you redirect a conversation when someone brings up something uncomfortable at a dinner party. I sat with that for a long time, and then I opened my laptop and read, for the third time since it had arrived, the email from the office of the president at Westbrook University. It had come 4 months earlier, in October, with a subject line that read simply, "Keynote Address Invitation, May Commencement." Dean Margaret Hargrove's assistant had written that the dean had come across a profile in a marketing industry publication from that August, a piece about young entrepreneurs building agencies in secondary markets outside of major metropolitan centers. She had passed it to the commencement planning committee. They had discussed it. They were hoping I would consider speaking. What my family did not know, what no one in my personal life had known for 3 years, was the full shape of what I had been building since the December I left Prescott. I launched Alderton Creative in January of that same year, from the desk in the bedroom of my apartment in Durham. My starting materials were a used laptop, a monthly operational budget of $200 for software and tools, and a list of 7 potential clients I had already identified and researched before I made the call to leave school. I spent the first 6 months working 16-hour days, learning what I did not yet know by doing it wrong and then doing it differently, reading every resource I could find, building systems and processes and case studies from scratch. I wrote my first proper client onboarding document at 2:30 in the morning in March of that first year, not because anyone asked me to, but because I was losing time to disorganization, and I could not afford to lose time. I sent my first real case study, unsolicited, to 12 businesses I wanted to work with. 3 replied. 2 became clients. By the end of year 1, I had 9 active clients and monthly revenue of $11,000 and 1 part-time contractor named Darius helping with graphic design. By the end of year 2, I had restructured my pricing upward, released 3 smaller clients I had deliberately priced out, gained 5 larger ones I had specifically pursued, and crossed $180,000 in annual revenue. I had spoken at a small panel in Charlotte. I had been mentioned briefly in a regional business publication. I had stopped explaining what I did at holiday dinners, not because I was hiding it, but because I had decided that the people in those rooms had chosen not to understand it, and I was no longer going to spend energy trying to make myself legible to people who weren't looking. By the time Dean Hargrove's email arrived, Alderton Creative had 11 active contracted clients. 4 of them were regional companies with annual marketing budgets exceeding $50,000 each. My revenue in the fiscal year prior to the invitation was $412,000. My two primary contractors, Darius and a strategist named Wei, had both been with me for over a year. The magazine profile that caught the dean's attention had described the agency as a case study in methodical, data-driven growth built entirely outside the structures most marketers assume are necessary. I had been 28 years old when the article ran. My parents had not read it. I know because no one called. I confirmed my acceptance of the keynote invitation in January. I began writing the speech in the first week of February, the same week my mother called to suggest I not attend the ceremony. I wrote it in the evenings after my last client calls, at the kitchen table in Durham under the overhead light. I wrote it over 14 evenings and revised it on the 15th and 16th. On the 17th evening, I read it aloud to myself, standing at the kitchen counter, and I knew it was done because I could not find a single sentence I wanted to change. March brought the strongest month the agency had ever had. On the 7th of March, I signed a contract with a regional healthcare network in Charlotte for a 6-month digital campaign worth $38,000, the largest single contract in the history of Alderton Creative. I was in the parking lot of a coffee shop in Durham at 4:17 in the afternoon when the signed paperwork came through on my phone. I read it twice. Then I sat in the parked car for a long moment with the engine off and the afternoon sun coming flat through the windshield. There was no one to call. I mean that in the specific, honest way, not the dramatic way. There were people in my life, but there was no one who could hold the full weight of what that number meant in the context of everything I had chosen and given up and rebuilt to get there. I had learned over 3 years to receive things alone, to hold the wins and the losses in the same steady hands. I held this one. And then I drove home. In April, I began making visits to Westbrook's campus in Chapel Hill for preparation meetings with the commencement events team. I met with Priya, the events coordinator who had been my primary email contact for months, twice in the first 2 weeks of April. We walked the amphitheater stage so I could feel the physical space. We confirmed my position in the ceremony program, the sequence of the morning, the microphone setup. I met Dean Hargrove in person for the first time on a Tuesday morning in mid-April, in her office on the 3rd floor of Whitmore Hall. 3 walls of bookshelves, a window overlooking the main campus quad. She came around her desk to shake my hand and held both of hers around mine for a moment that said something. "I have been looking forward to this meeting since August," she said. "Your story is precisely what this class needs to hear right now." We spoke for 40 minutes. She asked about the agency and about the healthcare contract I had just closed. She asked what I wished someone had told me at 22. I told her the honest answer, that the advice mattered less than finding the people who believed the advice was theirs to give, that choosing your own counsel is the harder and more necessary skill. She laughed the way people laugh when something is simultaneously funny and true. I drove back to Durham that afternoon with the windows down. The radio stayed off the entire way. I did not listen to music on that drive because I did not want anything filling the space around what I was feeling, which was something I did not have an exact word for. Gratitude, maybe. Recognition. The particular quiet that settles in when something you've been working toward for a long time begins to feel real in a way that is no longer only visible to you. I had spent 3 years in rooms where the only person who could see what I was building was me. This was the first time someone outside of a client relationship had looked at what I had made and said, without qualification, that it was worth something. Not worth something monetarily, though that had already been established. Worth something to say out loud in front of 400 people. Worth putting at the center of a morning that mattered. I held that on the drive home the same way I had learned to hold everything, quietly and by myself, and I did not need anyone else to hold it with me. My family remained entirely unaware. Natalie was consumed by final exams and the last revisions of her thesis. My parents were confirming the Marriott reservation and finalizing the guest list for the dinner. On the Friday evening before the commencement, at 9:51 in the evening, my father sent me a text message. It was the first direct communication from him in 6 weeks. No greeting, no punctuation beyond the period. "Natalie's ceremony is tomorrow at 11. Please respect the decision to keep the day simple. It means a lot to your mother. I read it once. I set my phone face down on the nightstand at 10:15 that night. I turned off the light and slept better than I had in several weeks. I arrived at Westbrook University's outdoor amphitheater the following morning at 9:30. Priya met me at the faculty entrance with a lanyard and a clipboard and walked me through the final logistics one time. The procession would begin at 11. President Okafor would give welcome remarks at 11:15. I would be introduced at 11:29 and speak at 11:30. Degree conferral would begin at noon. My reserved seat was in the third row of the faculty and speakers section, to the left of the general audience seating, with a clear sight line across the full amphitheater. I sat down. I placed my notes in my lap, and I watched the amphitheater fill around me. Families arrived in small clusters, moving through the warm May morning with programs fanning in the slight heat. Grandparents settled carefully into chairs. Small children in stiff Sunday shoes ran ahead of their parents along the gravel pathways between the seating sections. A string quartet played from a small platform to the right of the stage, something measured and pleasant that no one was really listening to. The light was the particular late spring light of the Carolina Piedmont, bright and generous and without shadows. At 10:48 in the morning, I saw my parents come through the main entrance on the far side of the amphitheater. My mother was in a pale blue dress I had never seen before, the kind purchased specifically for an occasion like this one, the kind you pressed the night before and hang on the outside of the closet door. My father was in a dark charcoal suit with a white dress shirt and no tie, which was his version of polished without formal. They moved through the rows together with the practiced ease of two people who have attended many public events over many years and know how to carry themselves in them. They found seats in the fifth row of the general section. A couple took the chairs beside them, and my father shook the man's hand and said something brief that made the man laugh. Douglas Alderton had always been able to make a stranger laugh within 30 seconds of meeting them. It was a real skill. It had nothing to do with how he treated the people who had stopped being strangers. For several minutes he did not look toward the faculty section. Then, at 10:53 in the morning, he did. I was looking down at the final page of my notes. I heard my name spoken before I looked up. One word. Flat. Certain. Claire. The way he said it when he wanted my complete attention and intended to have it. I looked up. The distance between us was approximately 40 feet, across the separation between the faculty section and the general seating. His expression moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise first, with the genuine quality of someone who did not expect the thing they are seeing. Then confusion, a brief recalibration, and then something harder and more certain moved across his face. Something that had made many decisions before and did not hesitate at this one. He stood from his seat. He stepped slightly into the aisle. And then, with the full, unself-conscious confidence of a man who has never once questioned his right to be heard in any room he occupies, he said it. You have no business being here. You are a dropout. You are an embarrassment to this family. Leave, now. The woman 3 seats to his right went completely still. The grandmother with the program stopped fanning. The 2 children in the row directly ahead of him turned around and stared without blinking. A faculty member seated to my left turned first toward me and then toward the source of the voice. 400 separate conversations dropped in volume around the 5th row of the general section. The string quartet was still playing to the right of the stage, but it sounded very far away, like music coming from another building entirely. I held my father's gaze for 3 seconds. I counted them without moving my eyes. And then I looked forward at the empty podium on stage. I settled my hands flat on top of my notes. And I waited. If you are still watching this story right now, I want you to stop for just a moment. Drop a comment below and tell me one word, just one word, that describes what you are feeling right now. And if you have ever been dismissed by the people who should have been the first to believe in you, type the word silent in the comments. I want to see how many of us are in this room together. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it right now. There are more stories like this one waiting for you here every single day. and I never want you to miss one. At 11:29 in the morning, Dean Margaret Hargrove walked to the podium in her black academic robe with the institution's gold trim along the hood. She arranged her papers with unhurried precision. She looked out at the 400 faces in the amphitheater with the genuine, settled warmth of someone who has run rooms for a long time and has never needed them to perform for her. She adjusted the microphone. And then, instead of moving directly to the introduction as I had expected from our planning conversations, she paused. "Before we hear from our keynote speaker this morning," she said, "I want to offer this audience a small piece of context, because I believe it matters deeply to what you are about to hear." The amphitheater went quiet in that particular way that outdoor spaces rarely go quiet. Even the breeze seemed to pause. This year's keynote speaker did not come to us through our traditional search process. She was not recommended by a corporate partner or a prominent alumni or a faculty committee. She came to my attention because a colleague handed me a magazine article last August and said simply, "You need to read this." I read it. I called a committee meeting the following morning. She looked out at the audience for a moment before continuing. The article was a profile of a 29-year-old woman in Durham, North Carolina, who had left college during her sophomore year, who had gone home and placed a business plan on a table in front of her family, and who had been told it was not worth the paper it was printed on. She left anyway. She built anyway. And by the time that article was written, her agency, Alderton Creative, had 11 active clients, 2 contractors, an annual revenue of $412,000. She had accomplished every single dollar of that without venture funding, without a university degree, without a safety net of any kind. When my committee read that article, we had one response, and it was unanimous within 10 minutes. We want her in front of our graduating class. I heard a sound from the direction of the 5th row. Not words, a sound. She is an entrepreneur, a builder, and a living example of what becomes possible when someone decides to trust the work over the approval. It is my genuine honor to introduce this year's commencement keynote speaker, Claire Alderton. 400 people applauded. The graduating class along the perimeter pathways applauded. Multiple members of the faculty section to my left stood before I had even risen from my chair. I stood. I smoothed my jacket. I took my notes and I walked to the stage. As I climbed the 3 steps to the platform and crossed to the podium, I allowed myself one single glance toward the 5th row of the general seating section. One glance, measured, brief, the length of a breath. My father was sitting very still with the commencement program open flat in both hands. He had found my name. I could see in the entire quality of his stillness, in the particular way he was holding his body without moving it, that he had found my name. His face had gone the particular pallor of a person who has just discovered, without warning and in a public place, that they have made a significant error in judgment. My mother's right hand was pressed flat over her mouth. She was not looking at the stage. She was looking at the program in his hands, as though by looking hard enough, she could make what was printed there say something different. I turned to face the audience. I set my notes on the podium. I looked out at 400 faces. "My name is Claire Alderton," I said. "I am a college dropout, and leaving was the best decision I ever made." The laughter came immediately. The real kind, not the polite kind. The kind that comes from recognition rather than obligation. And then it settled, and 400 faces were looking at me waiting, and I spoke. I talked about the precise and particular fear of making a choice that disappoints every person in the room who's supposed to be on your side. I talked about what it means to sit across a dining room table from your father with a business plan you have spent weeks building, and to watch him put it face down on the table after 11 seconds. I did not tell them whose father. I did not need to. I talked about the first client I ever signed professionally, a bakery in Asheville that paid me $600 for a single month of social media work, and how I treated those $600 as though they were worth 100 times that. Because they were not just money. They were evidence. Someone in the actual world had looked at what I did and decided it was worth paying for. No grade, no transcript, no letter of recommendation had ever given me that particular thing. That confirmation from the market was its own kind of credential, and it was the only one I needed to keep going. I talked about the late evenings when the doubt had a physical quality to it, the kind that sits on your chest at 2 in the morning when the apartment is silent and you are no longer certain whether the thing you believe about yourself is true or whether it is just a story you have been telling yourself to get through one more week. I talked about what it means to receive good news with no one to call, about learning to hold the wins and the losses in the same steady hands, about how that eventually stopped feeling like loneliness and started feeling like something closer to freedom. The specific freedom of a person who has stopped requiring external confirmation to know where they stand. I looked at the graduating class in their rows. Young faces, 21, 22, a few of them perhaps a year or two older than that, all of them on the threshold of something they could not yet fully see. Some of them had been awake the night before worrying about whether what they were about to receive would be enough for what they wanted to do in the world. I could see it in the slightly forward lean of their shoulders, the quality of their attention. The degree you receive today, I said, is not a finish line. It is a beginning. For many of you, it will be among the most important beginnings of your entire life, and you should carry it accordingly. But for some of you sitting in those chairs right now, the most important beginning of your life has nothing to do with today. It is going to happen in 3 years. Or 5. It is going to happen on an ordinary afternoon when you are sitting in a parking lot or at a kitchen table and you realize that the thing you have been building quietly without an audience, without applause, without anyone's permission, has become something undeniably real. That is the moment. That is the beginning I want you to be ready for, even if you cannot see it yet. I paused and let the amphitheater hold the quiet for a moment. Build in silence, I said. Do not wait for the approval of people who cannot yet see what you are building. That approval may never come, and you need to be able to move forward anyway. Do the work. Keep the records. Trust the data over the doubt. The quietest comebacks are always the loudest ones. I held that amphitheater for 15 minutes and 2 seconds. When I stepped back from the podium, the applause built the way a wave builds, from the back of the audience moving forward. And when it reached its peak, portions of the general seating section were on their feet. Dean Hargrove met me at the edge of the stage. She took both my hands in hers. "Exactly what I hoped," she said quietly. Just between us, I walked back to my seat. My hands were completely steady. The ceremony concluded at 12:47 in the afternoon. Graduates processed out in 2 long columns to recorded music. Families moved toward the reception lawn where white draped tables held champagne, sparkling water, and small sandwiches arranged on tiered platters. I stayed in the speaker section for several minutes speaking with faculty who came to introduce themselves. The university's events director gave me her card and told me they would be reaching out about a fall panel series. A professor from the business department asked if I had ever considered a teaching role. I told her I was genuinely open to it. I meant it. It was 1:15 in the afternoon when my mother found me at the edge of the reception lawn. She came alone. My father was not with her, and I noticed that without making anything of it, she stopped a few feet away at the distance people maintain when they are not sure of their welcome. Her pale blue dress looked different up close than it had from across the amphitheater. Her eyes were red at the rims in the way of someone who has been holding back tears for a long time and is nearly out of places to store them. "Claire," she said. I waited. I didn't know. 3 words, offered carefully, as though they might serve as shelter. "I know you didn't," I said. Not cold. Level. The way a surface is level. "Your father," she began. "Mom," I said it gently. "I don't need an explanation. I'm glad you were here. I hoped the speech meant something." She looked up at me with her eyes searching for something familiar, something she knew how to respond to. Anger, she could console. Hurt, she could address. My face gave her neither, because I had neither left in me. 3 years of building had used every drop of what that anger might have been. There was nothing remaining to spend on this moment. "Natalie is looking for you," I said. "Go be with her. Today belongs to her." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She nodded once. slowly, in the way of someone who has understood something they wish they hadn't, and she walked back across the lawn. My sister found me 20 minutes later near the far edge of the reception area, still in her cap and gown with her mascara tracking slightly beneath both eyes in the way of genuine emotion. She walked directly to me and put both arms around me and held on without speaking for a long moment. I held her back. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally said. "Because I needed to know I could do it first," I said. She pulled back and looked at my face for a moment. She was 24 years old, and in that moment she looked both younger and older than I had seen her. "I am so proud of you," she said. "I should have said that in a lot of different situations, and I am sorry I didn't say it." I told her she did not need to apologize. I meant it. I have spent a great deal of time since that afternoon thinking carefully about what I want to say about my parents, and this is the honest conclusion I keep returning to. They were not monsters. I want to say that plainly, because it would be a simpler, cleaner story if they were. Douglas and Patricia Alderton loved their children in the specific and limited way they understood love to operate, which was conditional, which was tied to evidence they could read, which was measured in transcripts and titles and things a person could state clearly at a dinner party without needing to explain. I was not producing evidence in a form they were equipped to recognize, so they stopped paying attention to the evidence. They stopped looking. That is not the same as cruelty, but it is not without consequence. The absence of attention is its own kind of instruction. My father called 9 days after the ceremony. It was a Sunday evening at 7:40 in the evening. I answered. He talked around it at first, the way he always moved toward difficult things. The weather, a situation at work, my grandmother's upcoming birthday. And then, in the sideways way that sometimes happens, he arrived at the point. "I may have been too rigid," he said, "about certain things." "Yes," I said. A pause. "That agency of yours, 400,000. 4012, I said. Another pause. Then, I should have read the folder. He was talking about the business plan I had placed on the dining room table 7 years earlier, the one he had picked up and looked at and set face down after 11 seconds. "You should have," I said. "I'm sorry for what I said at the ceremony." He said it without decoration or surrounding context, just the sentence by itself. It was possibly the most direct thing he had ever said to me as an adult. I told him I appreciated it. I told him I had no interest in a relationship built on demonstrated worth or ongoing proof of merit, that if we were going to have something real going forward, it would need to be built differently than what we had before. He said he understood. Whether he fully did, or whether understanding and actually changing what needs to change are the same thing in his case, I genuinely cannot tell you yet. Some repairs take longer than the original damage. Some never fully close. I have made peace with not knowing the outcome, because I no longer need the outcome to feel certain about who I am. What I know with complete and settled clarity is this. I did not leave Prescott College because I was afraid of hard work or incapable of discipline. I left because I had already found the work that was mine to do, and I had the clarity, at 20 years old, to recognize it when I found it. I did not build my agency to prove something to my parents. I built it because spending my one life doing something approximate, something chosen by other people's fear on my behalf, was simply not a thing I was willing to do. Not then. Not now. Not ever. The stage at Westbrook University was not revenge. I want to be careful about that word because it implies a game being played, and I was not playing a game. I was working. The stage was simply the most visible moment of something that had been happening quietly in my apartment for 3 years, in the early mornings and late evenings, at a kitchen table under an overhead light with a cup of tea going cold. The room caught up to the work. That is the whole of what happened. The room finally caught up to anyone watching this right now who is building something in the silence, something the people closest to you have not yet decided to believe in. You are not obligated to make yourself legible to people who have chosen not to learn your language. Do the work. Keep the records. Stay calm. The approval may never come, and you need to be able to move forward without it. The quietest comebacks are always the loudest ones, and the room catches up. It always does. And the question I want to leave with you today is this. Is there something you have been building in silence that the people around you have not yet seen? What is it? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. I want to know what you are building in the quiet. I want you to know that someone out here is paying attention to it. Thank you with everything I have for staying with this story all the way to the end. You didn't have to. You chose to. And that choice matters to the women behind every story on this channel more than you may ever fully know. Every view, every comment, every share you send into the world reaches another woman sitting alone in a quiet room building something, without an audience, and tells her that her silence was not invisible, that her work is already counting even before anyone else can see it, that the room will catch up. If this story moved something in you today, please subscribe to Revenge Chronicles and share it with one person who needs to hear it right now. We release a new story every single day, and every one of them is built for the woman who was told her story was not worth telling. We believe every story is worth telling. We will see you tomorrow.